Hello, and welcome to another episode of Chuchu is a Ranker. On this episode, we're going to be discussing the discography of Norwegian folk duo Kings of Convenience, comprised of Erlend Øye and Erik Lambek Boe, henceforth to be referred to as Erlend and Erik because, well, I don't want to butcher the pronunciation of their names any longer than I absolutely have to. Yeah, anyway, they hail from the town of Bergen in, well, Norway because I already mentioned that they were Norwegian. What do you want from me? I painted myself into a narrative corner because, well, I'm an idiot. Anyway, Erlend and Erik have a very interesting dynamic as they are basically polar opposites. Erik is more reserved and introspective while Erlend is a gadabout town flamboyant type. It frequently causes friction between the duo and they have a bit of a testy relationship with each other but are ultimately bonded forever by the gorgeous music that they make. As a folk duo, things are pretty stripped back, but initially on their debut they paired the folk with elements of indie rock, but by the time their third album was released they had totally filtered out the rockist aspects, becoming a purely acoustic folk act. And as for my own fandom, yeah, I absolutely love Kings of Convenience, I think they're great. Folk isn't really a go-to genre for me, but Kings of Convenience are definitely my go-to folk band, and when I made my own solo debut album, I made a folk record with Kings of Convenience very much in mind, so, you know, pretty big influence on me personally. And yeah, the band have a very consistent discography, not much to complain about really. They have 4 studio albums and 1 odd outlier, which I'm just going to throw in there as well just to chum up the waters a bit. So without further ado, let's be complete rankers and rank up a storm. These are the studio albums of Kings of Convenience ranked from worst to best. Coming in last, dead last, we have Versus, which is the odd outlier I mentioned in the intro. So this is a Hatful of Hollow style compilation record released in 2001, just after their debut album. It features alternative versions, remixes and re-recordings of songs from their debut album, usually with an electronica bent. Erlend Øye has more than a slight penchant for electronica, as another musical project of his is The Whitest Boy Alive, which completely focuses on it. He also sings a couple of hits for electronica duo Riot, so I think it's fair to say that this is his baby. Sadly, as an album, this doesn't really work. There's just too much repetition on this. On this record, you have 2 versions of Failure, 2 versions of Leaning Against the Wall, and 2 versions of The Weight of My Words. And a lot of the remixes just don't quite hit. They're often just the basic track with lots of unnecessary blips and bloops and synth stabs added. That said, a few tracks are worthwhile. The alternative arrangement of Failure adds bigger drums and some triumphant trumpets, which makes the track pop out a little bit more. Although this is also balanced out by a re-recorded version of the same track, which is pretty dire. The giant highlight though, and definitely the reason you should check out this record, is the opening track, a remix version of I Don't Know What I Can Save You From by Riot. So Riot are also from Bergen, which is the Kings of Convenience's hometown, and here they've basically gutted out the original tune and replaced it with their own brand of melancholic electronica. Yeah, and it's just a thing of beauty and was my own introduction to Riot. Like, I just needed to hear more of whoever remixed that track, and Riot became one of my very favourite bands of all time, so I can thank this record for introducing me to them. But yeah, ultimately when it comes to this record, it's just kind of a curio for hardcore fans. It's just one of those records that you might listen to once or twice and then just forget existed. So yeah, easy last place on this list. Now the outliers out the way, we're into the main body of the band's work, the weakest of which is their third album, Declaration of Dependence from 2009, and yet this album is stripped back, entirely concentrating on folk, but on this one, the band are at their most inconsistent. Half the record is great and there are some really memorable tunes on here, but some songs just don't quite rise to the occasion. Tracks like Peacetime Resistance, Freedom and Its Owner, and Second to None can't match the lofty standard that Kings of Convenience have set themselves. The saddest casualty is the song Riot on an Empty Street, which was the title of the band's second album, so you have some kind of expectation of something special. Alas, it doesn't quite deliver, although the closing piano section is nice enough. But there are also plenty of highlights too. 2425 is another classic opener for the band, full of catchy vocals and great guitar lines. Mrs. Cold is the band at their most Smiths-esque. You can hear the influence plain as day on that one. Boat Behind has that typical kind of jazzy piano groove and makes for a great lead single. Rule My World sounds a hair away from just breaking out the synths and partying like it's the 1980s all over again. And my favourite track off of this is the minimalist closer Scars on Land. I love the way it's so minimal that when a full note or riff gets plucked, it just totally commands your attention. Yeah, so ultimately this isn't a bad record, but definitely the band's weakest studio album. Next up, we have Riot on an Empty Street, which was the band's second album from 2004. And yeah, at this point on the list, I'm just out of negative things to say. The only remotely negative thing I can think of to mention is that the track Live Long is throwaway fluff, but just otherwise everything is absolute gravy, with tons of stripped back folk and jazz, and just a touch of indie rock with the pop flavoured single I'd Rather Dance With You, bringing down the house with its catchy flair. Other amazing highs include the Simon & Garfunkel aping opener Homesick, which has this amazing lyric about desperately searching through boxes in order to find that one mixtape that reminds you of home. Misread has more beautiful jazz piano. Cayman Islands feels like endless travel and holiday romance. Know How and the Build Up feature spiraling outros with female-led refrains. Surprise Ice has cascading melodies to die for, and Gold in the Air of Summer dares to even rock out a little with more direct rhythm guitar work. So yeah, Riot on an Empty Street is pretty much a flawless folk album. To be honest, these top three albums are almost interchangeable in terms of quality. There's nothing but tiny increments between them. This is just absolutely amazing stuff from Kings of Convenience. Next up, we have Quiet is the New Loud, which was the band's debut album from 2001. Whilst mostly folk, this one does have a few more overtly indie rock tracks on it, most notably Toxic Girl and Failure. And whilst those tracks are nice additions, I also think that they're the reason that this album doesn't quite hit number one. There's a reason as to why Kings of Convenience dropped the more layered sound, and it's because it's just not needed. The duo are at their best when it's just them with no added distractions, which is why number one is number one. But the true highlights on this debut are of startling quality. The opening, Winning a Battle, Losing a War, kicks off the band's tradition of killer openers. I Don't Know What I Can Save You From has a beautiful melancholy lilt to it. The Weight of My Words is dark-hued but incredibly catchy. Leaning Against the Wall describes the debilitating shock of getting broken up with, but my favourite sequence is actually the last four songs. Little Kids is about the little moments you recollect from the moment a relationship breaks down. It's so beautiful and sad. And Summer on the West Hill is one of my favourite songs of all time. The lyric, I now know there is a world beyond the small place I was coming from. I feel at home here in the middle of nowhere. I will never know the names of these places that I travel through to reach the coastline. I've been told I will be there in time. Mwah! Chef's kiss. I fucking love that lyric. It's one of my favorites of all time. And yeah, The Passenger is really sinister and dark, and I love that menacing electric guitar line. And the closer, Parallel Lines, ends the album with an atmospheric flourish. It's beautiful reverb-laden piano, ending a debut record to fucking die for. Phenomenal stuff from Kings of Convenience here. So here we are at the top of the mountain, and the gold medal for Kings of Convenience is going to go to the band's fourth and most recent album, Peace or Love, from 2021. And yet there was a 12-year gap between the band's third album and this one, and they've obviously been storing up killer tunes and perfecting them in their time away, because yeah, this record is just absolutely perfect. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it totally plays to the strengths of the band. It's stripped back almost completely with little in the way of overdubs, and full of songs that satisfy every craving you might have in relation to this band. And yeah, the melodies are all exactly on point, and those 12 extra years have added a frisson of maturity which really suits this band well. But the aspect that really puts this over the top for me is the guitar work. Some of the most exquisitely beautiful acoustic guitar work I've ever heard is on this record. The new extended instrumental sections and the way the guitars interplay with each other is just phenomenal. And I really like the extra space that the band allow themselves to do that. All these songs breathe just right. Nothing feels forced or stunted or too long. It's just exactly right. Just exactly how it should be. Highlights on this album include the lead single, Rocky Trail, just a perfect nod to the band's typical style, immediately familiar and yet new with its gorgeous instrumental finale. Comb My Hair is beautifully restrained. Angel, with its super memorable lyric, Angel. She's an angel, although she might be, how should I put it, slightly promiscuous. Love is a Lonely Thing and Catholic Country are gorgeous collaborations with female artist Feist. Fever is the band at the most rhythmic and pop orientated, and Song About It is unbelievably catchy and soulful with beautiful guitar trills running all the way through it. So yeah, this is just a truly flawless album without a single second of dead air on it. And that's it, that's my list. But that might not be your Kings of Convenience list. Please sound off in the comment section and tell me how you'd rank these records. Like, share, subscribe, and all that other kind of YouTube jazz. Take care of yourself, but most importantly, just keep on ranking.